Why do movies work so well? What does film reveal about the way that the brain processes reality? And what does any of this have to do with omniscience or simulation or jumping around in time, or why dogs don't do story, or what you would think if you saw aliens gluing all their attention to purple spheres? Welcome to Inner Cosmos with me, David Eagleman. I'm a neuroscientist and an author at Stanford, and in these episodes we examine brains to understand who we are and where we're going. There's a peculiar kind of magic that happens when the lights go down and the screen glows to life and we find ourselves pulled into another world. We find ourselves in lots of new places. We become hobbits or hitmen or lonely robots or star-crossed lovers. We might find ourselves in a courtroom showdown or an alien invasion. And for the next 2 hours, we're not just watching something, we're feeling it and living it. And I mean this physically. Your heart beats faster when the protagonist on the screen is in danger. You can physically weep at losses that are someone else's. You root for people who don't exist. And your brain genuinely enjoys triumph when that person succeeds after all that they went through. So the bottom line is that you can sit in front of a flat screen and you're perfectly still, but your brain experiences movement and depth and emotion and social connection and victories. So to appreciate how weird this is, imagine that we landed on some alien planet and we saw that at any given moment, about half these funny-looking aliens are carrying around purple spheres and they're staring at these things like catnip. And we would wonder what these purple spheres are. And if you were a neuroscientist who studied alien brains, you'd suspect that something is going on with these spheres neurally. Whatever it is, the purple sphere is doing something exciting to the alien's normal brain function. And whatever the sphere was doing, these aliens liked it, or they couldn't stop, or whatever. So flip the script and imagine what it would be like if some alien species came here and they were hovering around over our planet. And what they would see is billions of humans seating themselves in front of flat screens. Most of these humans have these screens installed on their walls where they live, and there are big spaces where bunches of humans gather around to look at a single screen. And increasingly, the humans have figured out how to shrink these down to carry these screens around in their pocket. So the question the alien would ask is, how is it that something made of pixels of light and little bits of sound can reach so deep inside of the humans? And that's not a trivial question. In neuroscience, we're still working to figure out many of the mysteries of that question. It goes straight to the heart of what it means to have a brain that constructs reality, not just from sensory input, but from stories. Our brains are narrative machines. They carve time into chunks, they make predictions, they fill in the blanks, they form internal models of what might happen next. And this is the neural technology that allows us to navigate the real world, but it also means that we are astonishingly susceptible to being pulled into the unreal world. At least for now, movies are one of the most sophisticated forms of unreality that we've invented. They manipulate time and space. They guide our attention. They compress months into moments. They stretch seconds into minutes. Often, what movies do is they bypass the slow machinery of conscious thought and cut straight to the unconscious. They use music and editing and facial expressions and body language to cue us about what to feel and when to feel it. And the most fascinating part is that we go along with it. We forget that we're sitting in a theater or in our living room. our brains suspend disbelief, not by turning off, but by doing exactly what they're wired to do, to make sense of the world through sensation and story, even when that world is completely invented. And this gives us some clues about what is running in our brains under the hood. Because when we watch a movie, our brains don't just observe, they simulate, they mirror, they empathize. Brain regions involving vision and movement and memory and prediction and pain, these all get involved. When a character throws a punch toward the camera, our visual systems cause our motor systems to flinch. When two people kiss on screen, our oxytocin system stirs. When a plot twist defies our expectations, our reward circuits light up like we just solved a puzzle. And the line between film and memory can even blur. So sometimes people will recall a moment from a movie as though it were from their own memory. Some movie scenes feel more vivid and emotionally charged than things that actually happened to us. So all of this leads to a set of questions that reach beyond the movie theater. What does film reveal about the way that the brain processes reality? What tricks of editing or framing or timing speak to our perceptual systems? How does storytelling, and especially visual storytelling, exploit the quirks of our cognition? So I'm very happy to be joined today by Dr. Jeff Zacks. He's a professor of psychological and brain sciences at Washington University in St. Louis, and he's the author of Flicker, Your Brain on Movies. His research bridges cognitive neuroscience and psychology and media studies. And his book is about what is going on inside your skull when you're caught up in a story on the screen. So grab your popcorn and settle in. We're going to find out what happens when your brain goes to the movies. So Jeff, from a neuroscience perspective, what is going on in the brain when we sit in a dark theater and we surrender to story?
So the first thing is the same stuff that's going on in the rest of your life. Our brains evolved to deal with a complex dynamic environment, and being in front of a film is one of those, and being out in the world is one of those. And to be honest, in lots of ways, it doesn't care that much which is which.
And why is that? Why, when we're sitting in front of a flickering screen, does your brain not care so much?
One big reason in evolutionary terms is that movies are young, right? Movies have been around for a little less than 130 years, and we haven't experienced significant brain evolution in that time. And another important piece is even those of us who are real media addicts, that diet is being interspersed with a lot of experience being in a 3D world where we're locomoting and acting. And all of that is integrated and training each other up all the time. And so it's not like the experiences of being in a screen are reshaping our brains in a major way.
Now, the way you set this up in the book is you talked about the mirror rule and the success rule as a way of introducing some of these ideas. Can you tell us what those are?
Yeah, sure. The mirror rule says, other things being equal, if you see other people doing stuff, you might want to do things that are congruent with us. So if somebody smiles, you might want to smile back. If someone reaches out their hand to shake yours, you might want to reciprocate. The success rule is just learning. It says, over time, the stuff that you have learned how to do that's worked in the past, do that this time. Other things being equal.
And how does that apply to watching a movie, these two rules?
So one important way that this has big effects on our perceptions when we're watching film is that we evoke actions that we might perform and we evoke emotional states that we might experience based on what we're seeing other people do. So if you're seeing someone whose face is 8 feet high on a big screen crying in front of you, you're going to tend to adopt an emotional tone that's congruent with that. If you see someone who is lunging toward you out of the screen, you're going to tend to flinch a little bit. So that would be an example of the mirror rule in the first case and the success rule in the second case.
Okay, so you're in the theater, you're watching a movie, you're mirroring what you're seeing on the screen, you're maybe ducking a little bit, moving when things are coming at you. But we get deeply into the story. And one way that you describe this in your book is that we have an event model of what is happening on the screen. So let's dive into that.
Yeah, sure. So as we're wandering around our complex dynamic world, there's islands of stability where stuff may be moving, but it's moving in a consistent way. Like you're on a swing and the swing is going back and forth. And then you hop off the swing and that island of dynamic stability changes and we kind of march from one stable regime to another and another. That's just the structure of human experience. While you're in one of these stable regimes, it's helpful to have a model in your head of like what's going on. If I'm on the swing and then my brain's processing this visual input and this motor input, it can predict what's going to happen in the near future based on that. But as soon as I hop off, it'd be a good idea to update and change the parameters of that situation. So we call those mental representations of the current situation event models. And there's good reason to think that a decent chunk of what the brain's doing in normal everyday living your life is building up a model of what's happening now and then updating it from time to time when the situation changes.
And so when that comes to story, when we're watching Harry Potter or Game of Thrones or something like that, what does an event model look like in that context?
Yeah, so take Game of Thrones, we're in a room where there's a bunch of characters talking about the next battle coming up. And then they walk out of the room and a couple of them pull off to the side to scheme and plot. And while they're in that room, our brain is going to keep track of who are the characters that are present, where are they located, so that as you go from over the shoulder shots and close-ups, you're only seeing a couple people at a time, which is totally like how our normal vision works, right? We're looking around the room, but we got a representation of that whole scene. Then you walk outside and you've got to update that so that you have a representation of the subset of characters and the folks that are not there. You're not expecting them to pop up. And you're also representing that you're in a different location and that the geometry of the stuff in that location is different.
So this is an example, in most of my episodes, I end up talking about the internal model, how your brain is locked in silence and darkness. You're putting together a model. One way that we do that, for example, is with, your spouse or your friend or anything like that. You're running a model of what that person is like. But in the context of a movie, you're running a large model of all the things that have happened and might happen and what's going on there. And that's a big part of why we live story and experience story with the kind of depth that we do. Is that right?
Yeah, totally. And, that representation of your spouse or your friend that you're hanging out with, that's a huge part of your event model in real life. And also in film, if you got the two characters who are sneaking off to plot their revenge, their topic of conversation, their motives, their affect, the way that they're moving and where they're headed through the space, all of that is a super important part of comprehending what's going to happen. We're intensely social creatures. And so a big part of our event models most of the time are models of the other people in our environment.
That's right. Now, this is related to an issue, which is when I was younger, I was really surprised that movies worked because you're watching some scene, let's say some people plotting something inside the castle, and then you cut to a scene where you have, bearded horsemen riding across the plains and, you're suddenly in a completely different location and different part of the plot. And people don't scream or get surprised, but they're totally fine to see the thing switch from one to the next in the space of a frame. So why is that?
Yeah, so that part is really kind of bonkers that it works because in our real life, there are these continuity constraints, right? Time doesn't jump around, space changes. Like you walk through a doorway and that's a huge deal because the affordances of the space totally change in a way that they don't as you're walking within a room. But, you don't walk through the doorway and wind up in France. But in a movie, that's totally normal. And my understanding from reading the history is that early filmmakers figured out that this was doable kind of by accident, right? The original idea was that what we're going to do with these cameras is we're going to film stage sets and we're going to do things kind of like we do in the theater. And just as people were putting stuff on film and then looking back at the recordings and seeing what happened when you went from one take to the other, they realized, oh, you can do this. And the brain is going to use the mechanisms that it uses to update things when you walk through that doorway and apply them to the situation where you're walking through a doorway from one continent to another that might be hundreds of years apart. And surprisingly, it works.
It strikes me actually that we do have some discontinuities in our lives anyway, in the sense that, you go to sleep and then you wake up 8 hours later. That's a discontinuity in time. And in space and time, we often have these things where we notice something we hadn't seen before. Suddenly a scene changes because we realize that our friend is standing over there or there's a danger over here. And so in a sense, our model of what's happened is suddenly flipped into something else. And so we do have a bit of discontinuity in our lives. But this is a really interesting question about what do films tell us about brains? Because as people figured out how to make movies and made discoveries along the way, it gives us some insight into what's happening under the hood.
One of the pieces relates to a topic that you've covered multiple times on the pod, which is the way that this system for representing internal models can multiplex. So the same machinery that we're using to simulate a model of what's happening right now, we can drive, in that case, the model's being driven mostly by what's in front of our eyeballs, but we can drive that same machinery by retrieving stuff from episodic memory, by thinking about what might happen in the future, by thinking about a story that somebody's telling us. And so if you're wandering through your environment and you see an old friend and that reminds you of the last time you saw them, that's another kind of discontinuity that I think is part of why the ability to cut across time and space works, is because your brain is used to shifting these models rapidly and across big shifts in order to think about stuff that is offline but related to the current situation.
Yeah. I think one of the things that's so striking to me about movies is that we have all these edits and cuts and changes in camera angles, but we're not aware of the trickery of that at all. We just don't even notice it. Even when there's a conversation between two people and the camera keeps switching angles, we don't suddenly react in fear that we've changed position. It's like we're a floating ghost in the scene, and it doesn't bother us that we're moving positions all over.
So part of the picture is that, even though the world out there is stable and doesn't move around, our visual systems are anything but, right? So we're moving our bodies, we're moving our heads, and we're moving our eyes a ton. And then we're blinking. And all of that is maximizing our brain's estimate of the information content that it's going to get out of the scene, right? It's very actively directing the eyeball to the points in the scene that the brain at that moment thinks are likely to be important. And it's got to do that because we have a foveated eye, as you've discussed. And, we've got this tiny little bit of high resolution sensor that's got to be pointed at the right stuff. But I'll tell you, one of my buddies in film studies asked me a question a few weeks ago that has totally baked my noodle on this, which is that explains the kind of camera motion where the point of view of the camera is stable, but the camera is rotating or even panning, right? But if you think about a simple, like over the shoulder of the shot, it's totally normal to have the camera's position jump around. So it's not just that the camera is pointing in different directions, but the camera is moving around the room discontinuously. And as far as I know, there's no evidence that brains like that any less, though that's a very ecologically implausible kind of camera movement than camera movement like cuts where you're just rotating the camera. And it seems to me that is surprising.
Right. There's a lot of this that I find surprising, and I think this must come back to the issue of event models. So a scene from Batman, let's say he's coming off the roof and you are behind him, the camera's behind him as he goes off the roof, and then you're below him as he's coming down. And then you suddenly find yourself in a taxi cab sitting below, and a taxi cab driver is eating, and then the roof suddenly dents in as Batman lands on top of the roof. But it doesn't bother us that we've completely switched points of view. We're now with the taxi driver. I guess it's because we have this event model running about, okay, Batman is falling, and we're happy to switch perspectives on it all the time.
I think that's exactly right. I really am mystified that this works, but I think that the answer is going to have something to do with the fact that these representations are not primarily egocentric. They're what we call allocentric, right? So they're divorced from our personal perspective. And so what the brain is really caring about in that situation is, what's the thing I want to gather about information about next, right? So I want to get a good look at the cab driver. If I were really there, I would kind of crane my head and focus my eyes on them. If the camera can just jump to in front of the cab driver and give me that angle, as long as it's telling me about the stuff that I'm trying to learn about, my brain might be okay, because it's not so worried about the personal viewpoint on the scene. It's building this somewhat perspectiveless representation of the scene.
That's right. And a loose analogy here is with this concept of mentalese, which is to say, if you're bilingual and I tell you a joke in one language, you might turn right around and tell it in a second language to someone else. And so what that means is you haven't stored my joke in a series of phonemes, but instead it's the concept of the joke, the concept of let's call it the event model of this person said that to this person and so on. And it's somehow the same thing. So when Batman is falling, it's this thing happening in the world. And we appreciate that. We can see that from different perspectives, including the taxi cab driver's perspective. And what really matters is the thing itself that's happening. That's not totally about the egocentric perspective. Does slow motion challenge the brain in any way that's different from normal scenes?
So I think you know a ton more about that than I do. I don't know that I have any genius ideas about slow-mo. But no, there's one thing that I think is important, which is that we can think about events on a huge range of timescales, from like the decay of a quantum particle to the heat death of the universe. And I think that we do that by recycling the machinery that we use to build event models on a human scale. Just like we can think about spatial scales from, again, subatomic particles or atoms up to planets and galaxies. And we do that by using like microscopes or telescopes or drawings that take those very disparate spatial scales and map them on to like the scale of chairs and coffee cups and stuff. So the brain has some way of taking these very different time scales and mapping them onto a human scale, doing radical slow-mos or fast motion.
That is totally right. It's very surprising to me always how the brain can extrapolate the sort of things that it knows and do different scales of space or time. Let me ask you something else. How does the brain react to suspense? So what do filmmakers do to generate tension, and how do our brains respond to that?
The brain is, to a significant degree, a prediction machine. Your brain's always trying to figure out what's coming down the pike. And just being able to do that on the time scale of a fraction of a second or a few seconds is hugely helpful, right? So if there's an object moving quickly in your general direction, being able to predict the exact trajectory, it's going to tell you whether you got a duck or not. If you're starting to talk about your friend's surprise party and you see them getting close enough that they might hear, being able to predict what they're going to be able to hear in a couple seconds is important for avoiding that social faux pas. And Hitchcock wrote awesome things about surprise and suspense and how they work in film. Suspense is often a situation where there's a couple potential outcomes in play, and you don't know how it's going to unfold. But there's also situations where you have a piece of information that the characters don't have. And so the ambiguity is not like about whether there's a bomb in the trunk that's going to go off, but about how the characters are going to figure out that there's a bomb in the trunk and whether they're going to avoid getting blown up when it goes off. And so that's all stimulating that prediction system, confronting it with situations where the entropy is maximal, where you're like super uncertain about what's going on dimensions that your brain is invested in.
And this comes back to the same issue about theory of mind that we talked about with, the cab driver who doesn't know that something's falling and suddenly his roof caves in. It's the same thing here. We know that there's a bomb in the trunk, and we know that the characters don't know. And so there's the suspense of hoping that they get there. But again, we're able to take this omniscient view in a movie that is it's sort of surprising. It's an issue of theory of mind in this case. So you've studied how sometimes people misremember events in films as though they were real life memories. So what does that tell us about memory more generally?
Our brains are encoding information about what's in the scene, what happened, and also about meta information, metadata about like, how did I learn about that? Did I learn that somebody got a broken arm because I was there and I saw it, or because a mutual friend told me about it, or because I saw it on the news? If I'm going to reason in the future about what to do next time I see that person, or what to do next time I'm on the slippery sidewalk where they fell and broke their arm, it actually doesn't matter so much how I learn the information, what the metadata is. And so it turns out that we're much better at tracking the what than the metadata. And so that leads to these confusions, which can be important for memory errors, especially now that we live in a social ecology of storytelling, let alone misinformation. Misinformation is a whole other ball of wax. But just normal telling each other stories for entertainment leads to the potential to confuse stuff that I learned in the context of entertainment with stuff that I learned in the context of I was actually there, or it was a source purporting to be veridical, like a news source.
And this is the sense in which watching movies can actually reshape our cognitive habits or the things we know, because we essentially don't have good source memory. What that means, just for the listeners, is, you know what a pomegranate is, or you know that Paris is the capital of France, but you probably can't remember when and where you learned those items. You just know those items. And it may be the same thing with getting lots of practice with some idea or heroism or doing the right thing and so on. Movies can contribute, stories more generally can contribute to that, even if you don't remember the source. It's as though it happened to you.
Totally. And we learn both like specific events, like, my buddy broke their arm, or about general facts about the world, like, the pomegranate has seeds that you can eat. And one of the cool subtleties of reasoning that our brains just do effortlessly is if I'm reading a fiction story set in a world that is maybe quite different than my world or quite different than the real world, right? Say it's fantasy or science fiction. And I read that a computer works a particular way, or I read about I don't know how a thresher on a farm works, and I don't know anything about threshers. People are really pretty good at figuring out, like, is that a fact that I can import into my fact knowledge, or does that have to stay in the science fiction world? Which, that's a super subtle form of reasoning.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good one. So here's a question. After you wrote your book, do you feel that there are filmmakers who can use findings from neuroscience to design better or more emotionally impactful stories?
Yeah. And, one of the really awesome things about the scientific life that I've been lucky to lead is that I get to talk to some of my heroes about their experiences as filmmakers. And filmmakers are amazing psychologists and neuroscientists across the board. They don't have to be like formal students of the field, and most aren't. Like, most people are busy. But film has been doing these intensive experiments with many, many repetitions and large sample sizes over, more than 100 years with like real money on the line. So they've learned a ton of things. And so people, even with no, who don't read this stuff for pleasure, know a bunch of things. And when I ask them questions, they often know the right answers, or know answers that I didn't know were right until I asked them. And then there are some who are like, as you may imagine, even more fun for me as a geek, who like actually say, I read this thing in the Nature briefing, and do you think this would work? And that's super cool too.
Great. A couple of rapid fire questions. Is there a particular movie that to you exemplifies what the brain loves about cinema?
One of my favorite movies of all time is The Shining. And The Shining is amazing for many reasons, but one is that it plays with these model building facilities that we've talked about by taking just like one dimension, like the saturation of a red, or the geometry of motion of a tricycle, and exaggerating it just enough so that it crosses over from being normal to not being totally absurd, but just being deeply disturbing. This is what in robotics they call the uncanny valley. That movie lives like half of its life in the uncanny valley, and it contributes a lot to the creepiness of the film.
Great.
Cool.
What do you see as the line between movies and games? How's that line going to blur as we move into the future, where we can change what is happening on the screen?
Yeah, I think there's two important dimensions. One is point of view and field of view. So, traditional film, the width of the screen would be like 20 to 30 degrees of your visual angle. So if you got 360 degree view, think about, a little bit less than a 10th of that to a 20th of that. Now we can have head-mounted displays or immersive displays that are the full 360. And then the other thing is, in a movie, obviously, it's recorded. You don't have any control over what happens. And in gaming, what you do affects the world. One of the things that's really striking about movie perception is the degree to which our brains don't turn off that control part. Like, we do all these little twitchy behaviors while we're watching that indicate that the brain is trying to get you to run away when the thing is lunging, or trying to get you to lean in when it's an emotionally engaging experience. But in games, of course, you got to duck out of the way, or the boulder is going to land on you. So I think those are the dimensions that are super exciting, and those aren't secrets. Like, everybody who works in those fields is working on that stuff. And the question of how do you edit in an environment where you don't know in a 360 wide field of view situation, if you don't know exactly what the person's looking at, how do you edit? And if you need them to get a piece of information out of the scene, how do you make sure that they turn around and look at the character, look at the villain creeping in through the window? If they're looking in the other direction, is your story still going to work?
And I know you and I have both talked about this issue of what this all is going to mean in the future for having shared stories. So, we all watch Game of Thrones, we watch the same version of it, and we can talk about it later. But if everyone is experiencing their own movie where they get to do whatever and things happen that's responsive to them, we no longer have shared literature. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting open question. I think there's some reason to think that, well, first of all, there's a continuum, right? There's very open world games where, my experience in the game isn't going to be anything like yours. But still, there's some shared stuff, like how the physics of the game works and what kind of objects there are and what kinds of things you're trying to do and what kind of techniques you're learning. Like being a basketball player and meeting another basketball player who you've never played any games against. You don't have specific shared experiences, but you've got this shared type of experience with the skills and the objects and the situations that come up. And then there's other kinds of gaming that are much more plotty, right? Where you have choices that you can make, but they're all going to lead to the same destination. And people like both of those kinds of experiences.
Tell us what you mean by a temporal hierarchy and what you're thinking about in terms of that.
So as you're living your life, your brain's predicting what's going to happen in the near future. You're building up a model of what's happening now. But it turns out that you build those models on multiple timescales. So there are models that update every second or so, tens of seconds, minutes. And people like Chris Baldessano and Linda Gerligs have studied how the patterns of activity change. So different parts of your brain lurch from one stable pattern to another on different timescales. And those larger timescales are associated with integrating more modalities of information and more complex stuff. And we, over many years, have been interested in how at those boundaries, you see big phasic changes in brain activity across the brain, and those are hierarchically nested. And those turn out to be related. The magnitude of those turns out to be related to how much you remember later. So one important thing turns out to be that you're not just building a model, you're building a model that has multiple timescales, and you've got some stable patterns that the brain is actively maintaining for like tens of minutes and others that are being updated very quickly. As you're looking at a film, right, a film is going to last maybe 45 minutes for a really short narrative film to, 4 hours if you're watching Reds. And those longer films clearly exceed the capacity of our working memory systems to be able to maintain information in an activated state. But by building this nested hierarchy, and then by reaching back across long-term memory, the brain can build representations that allow it to track plot development over these long narrative timescales. Now, there's a whole other deal that happens when you think about like series fiction that so much of us spend a lot of time on now. And it's striking like how much you can enjoy and really understand a series, even if you can't remember what the heck was the name of that character from the other episode or exactly what happened. And part of that illustrates like how powerful just the emotional trajectory of the moment as sustained by what the characters are doing right now, and importantly, the music that's lying under it, is in like just sustaining that experience. If you look at people like dementia patients, they can have rich interactive relationships with their loved ones, even if they're not tracking the details of the plots of their lives over those longer timescales.
There's an interesting analogy here going on with large language models, which is that they come to know you, but of course they can't keep track of everything that you've ever written into them because that's just too big a context window. So what they do is they summarize along the way. And so what it knows about you is a summary of the last 5 months of conversation. And maybe there's a sense that that's what's happening when we watch a series. We just have sort of a paragraph in our mind that tells us about the emotional content and what's happening and where it is.
Yeah, totally. There's the term semanticization of memory. We think of it as something that happens over like decades, but it's also, that stuff is happening also super fast in the nervous system.
For the listenership, can you define what the semanticization of memory is about?
Yeah. So there's this term semanticization of memory, which means that over time, things become less like I'm really reliving this detailed experience, and more like I know this stuff and I kind of generally know about what's going on. And that's something that we think about as happening as memories consolidate over decades. But it also happens super fast within the experience of, say, watching a movie.
There's one last question I was going to ask you. I was just curious why other animals don't enjoy movies as far as we can tell. Obviously, they're not making movies, but even if I show to my dog a movie on the screen and I try to get him interested because maybe there's another dog, there's a barking dog in the movie, he just doesn't care at all. It doesn't hold his attention.
It's so funny that you asked that. I mean, maybe your dog is weird because I often open my talks with pictures of like dogs and cats and monkeys pointing with their heads engrossed, looking at screens. And some people report these like compelling, I mean, just go on TikTok, man. There's like all kinds of videos of pets interacting with screens and reacting. And I think there's some really actually interesting science. Like lots of pet animals will react to the sounds in a TV show as if they were really happening, right? And that'll happen regularly. Right? The dog starts barking on the screen and my dog starts barking. And then there sometimes, at least some animals seem to be doing that same kind of stuff with the video channel, but like what exactly they're getting out of it, I think there's some science to be done there.
Right. And this is the question is there something about the human brain that can appreciate story? Whereas if I followed a dog sniffing around and something happens and then something else happens to this dog, I mean, my dog certainly, even your dog presumably won't sit there for half an hour and watch it and keep tuning in every week.
Okay, that is totally interesting. So I am 100% convinced that our dog has event models and that like the capacity to build and update event models is pretty widely conserved across the mammalian taxa. But I'm not sure that my dog is tracking this story. Yeah, and I think we don't know that much about what aspects of the longer time scale of goal-directed experience other species are tracking. It's got to be related to these questions about chain goals and problem solving, which are surprisingly not conserved, right? On the one hand, you've got these crows and other corvids who can do these amazing chain goal things. But then you got lots of mammals who really don't seem to be able to do very much of that stuff. And I suspect that the same representations that are important for action are important for comprehension. And so I think it's possible that the dog's not tracking that much of the story.
Yeah, it seems like this would be a really good clue for us to dig down on into the future because dogs do mirror and they do have this success rule of reinforcement learning, of knowing what worked for them in the past.
And they represent the locations of objects that are occluded and stuff. They're clearly building event models.
Exactly.
But how they're integrating those into larger structures, here's a possibility. It might be that dogs are kind of like amnesic humans, right? So I can build a rich, detailed event model, and then as soon as I walk out that doorway, I can't do anything with that information from that last event model other than the general stuff that I learned from it, right? So I can do learning, but the ability to pull that old event model back and relive an experience based on that might be different across species. So that gets into the debates about the degree to which other species share episodic memory or episodic-like memory.
That's fascinating. And it might also be that the dog is incapable of taking on the omniscient point of view and understanding what it's like to be outside the story here and from these different angles. There are all kinds of aspects to visual storytelling that we naturally fall into and enjoy. But the interesting question for us for the future is, what are the elements that are missing or just slightly worse in other animals such that, at least as far as we can tell, they don't do story?
Yeah, totally. Oh, that's an interesting one.
So that was Jeff Zacks, professor of psychology at WashU in St. Louis. Our conversation tried to raise the curtain just a bit on one of the most captivating illusions we engage with, movies. And the conversation reminds us that the way we experience movies is not separate from real life, but it uses the same neural machinery that we use to navigate the real world. When a film cuts from one scene to another, your brain doesn't protest. It just fills in the blanks. It assumes continuity and it moves forward because that's what it evolved to do. When a character cries, your empathic systems don't ask if it's real. They simply resonate. When a jump scare makes you flinch, it's not because you believe you are in danger. It's because your brain can't not respond as if you were. And all of this tells us something important, something you hear me say every week, which is that we live inside our internal models. We don't catch the sensory details of everything happening around us. Instead, we construct general models of what is happening out there. And movies are particularly elegant manipulations of those models. Filmmakers, whether they know it or not, they are cognitive engineers. They shape attention, they manipulate time, they activate emotion. And we, as the viewers, we're not just passive recipients, we are co-constructing the experience. When you sit in a movie, your brain is on fire. It's stitching together fragments of light and sound into a narrative that feels whole and meaningful. Moment to moment, scene by scene, you work to make sense of what is happening. You're guessing what is coming next. You're feeling your way through the unfolding story. And this is part of why movies, or more generally stories, matter so much. It's not just that they entertain or distract us, it's that they let us practice being human. They sharpen our empathy. They give us rehearsal space for emotion. They let us explore lives that we're never going to live. They let us practice choices that we are never going to face. They let us explore futures that we are never going to see. And all of this can happen inside the safe, contained simulation of a story. So the next time you find yourself moved by a film where your heart rate elevates or your chest tightens or you feel a catch in your throat, remember, it's not just the story on the screen that's affecting you. It's the extraordinary, adaptive, prediction-making, meaning-seeking system in your head responding exactly as it was built to do. Go to eagleman.com/podcast for more information and to find further reading. Check out my newsletter on Substack and be a part of the online chats there. Or you can send me an email at podcast@eagleman.com with questions or discussion. Finally, watch the videos of Inner Cosmos on YouTube where you can leave comments. Until next time, I'm David Eagleman, and this is Inner Cosmos.